Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and you join me here on a very misty day in Boston where we're at the slog to pick up on the ghouls that we have been talking about, the mutations and what happens to them and the differences. So today we're going to talk a bit about their immortality and some of the other effects on their nervous system that could explain certain things, especially the aspect of the fact that ghouls all seem to eventually go feral, how that could happen, why that happens, and what options there are to prevent it. So I thought I'd come here to this log. Didn't realise it was going to be so foggy because this is obviously starts out as a ghoul settlement. You can add non-ghouls living here, but it's a ghoul settlement and they grow tarberries in this swimming pool. So if you've seen my Immortality and Fallout series, some of this stuff at the beginning might be a bit familiar to you, because ghouls have become functionally immortal, so they can be killed, so they're not completely, unkillable and what's the word I'm looking for? But they're not going to die of old age. Essentially, they'll kind of, if they're left unharmed, they could live forever. But if they're not invulnerable, they can be killed if they're injured enough. And the reason for this is the mutation that affects the autonomic nervous system that was discussed in the Chop Shop's terminal entries. So the mutation disrupts the decay of neurotransmitters, and these are communication molecules that cross the synapses, which are the connections. There's a little gap between neurons in the nervous system, and neurotransmitters basically take the signal, cross that gap, and pass the signal on to the next nerve cell. And they either stimulate that nerve cell to actively put it through another signal, or they inhibit them and stop the signal from going any further. And then these neurotransmitters are then reabsorbed into the neuron when they're not needed anymore, and they control a lot of bodily functions, including everything from cardiorespiratory functions, thought, movement, and basically everything else. So every function that your body has that is controlled by the nervous system, which is pretty much all of them, neurotransmitters are involved in that. And you've probably heard of some of them, even if you don't have a degree in neurology. Serotonin is well known as the mood regulator. That's often the target for medications that are used to treat things like depression. Dopamine is your reward chemical, so that's the feel-good chemical when you do something that you like, whether that's eating a piece of chocolate or whether that's, achieving getting a platinum trophy in a game on the PlayStation, that kind of thing. So anything that you do that makes you feel good in some way, you get dopamine from, and dopamine is the neurotransmitter that a lot of people with ADHD are lacking, because it's also involved in motivation, and that's where some of the symptoms of people that have ADHD get that from, because their dopamine receptors don't work properly. Essentially, norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline. There is two different terms for these ones, but either one is correct. And it's involved in the fight or flight response, so it deals with stress, it deals with preparing you to manage danger, as well as epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. Adrenaline's the more well-known term, but, it's called an EpiPen because it's epinephrine, which is adrenaline. It's the same thing, but there's two different terms for it, and either one's correct. But norepinephrine affects the blood vessels, so it changes which blood vessels are more open to blood flow, to increase blood flow to your muscles, to your lungs and things like that, while epinephrine primarily works on the heart. So upregulating these neurotransmitters keeps the body functioning to an extent, so the mutation affecting the nervous system seems to affect these particular neurotransmitters and keeps the body going when, there's a finite limit, which I talked about in the Immortality series, where essentially most species on the planet have a sort of set amount of heartbeats, which is why animals that are smaller and have a much higher heart rate, like mice, that, their heart rate's over 400 beats per minute, you can't count it just with the stethoscope. and they live for maybe a year or so, while, you know, an elephant that has a heart rate of like 40 beats per minute lives for 80, 90 years potentially. So there's a kind of almost like it's not a strict hard limit, but it's a kind of, this is the limitation of this species, and it's the kind of number of heartbeats. So that kind of dictates that smaller animals have higher heart rates and tend to live shorter lifespans.
Yes.
That kind of thing. So it's kind of an interesting concept. So if you affect that in some way, then you can affect the longevity of a species. And that's what seems to be happening with the ghouls here. There are other things like the telomerases, which prevent cell senescence, which is aging of the cell. So just a quick refresher on those. So inside the nucleus of your cell, you've obviously got your chromosomes, and the DNA on the very end of each of your chromosomes is called a telomere, and every time that cell divides and replicates, part of the end of the chromosome, the telomere, is lost. So eventually a cell is going to reach a point where all the telomeres are gone and it can't divide again. So eventually, when that cell lives out its natural lifespan, it's not going to keep reproducing. So enzymes called telomerases prevent that from happening and stop the time limit on regeneration of body tissues. Telomerases are often produced by things like cancer cells, which is how cancer cells can just keep reproducing uncontrollably, which is what cancer is. So that's kind of how that works. So it does seem like the ghouls potentially have something that helps with that, and, you know, sort of helping continue regeneration of their body tissues. We'll get back to, there's more on that later on when we're talking about the feral ghouls, so we will get back to this concept. But the ghouls do retain their memories, which is quite impressive, you know, that they can still remember a lot of things even after a long period of time. Are you okay there, Holly?
You think I'm beautiful now? You should have seen me before.
Yeah, actually, thanks for that. That's a nice segue into the next section. So ghouls retain their memories, and they can acquire skills and knowledge far beyond what a typical human lifespan could attain, just because they have more time, and you could learn anything you wanted with unlimited time. Thanks. But there's downsides to being ghouls, and unfortunately, as Holly kind of pointed out there for us, ghouls are what most people would describe as conventionally attractive. Not all of their body is capable of full regeneration. The skin, the hair, and the cartilage changes and loss is typical, so they don't always have a lot of hair. You know, their skin's quite wrinkled, thickened, or sometimes in some cases it's lost. As well as the cartilage, which means that they lose their noses. Their ears tend to be, you know, not as prominent. Because cartilage is what holds up your nose and your ears, rather than bone for the most part. Would also explain the fact that they do tend to have that kind of gravelly voice, like they've got a sore throat, because the larynx, the trachea, and your vocal cords are also supported by cartilage for the most part. There are some small bones called the hyoid bones that support the larynx and attach it to your skeleton. Oh, hello. But most of the vocal cords and the larynx and things, it's all cartilage that's there. So if there's changes to that, it could affect their voice, although it doesn't happen to all of them. Yeah. You know, we've seen that Dean Domino in Dead Money. Sorry, my brain's clearly not focusing today. Yeah, so Dean Domino, who you meet in Dead Money, has retained his voice, and so did Cooper Howard as the ghoul. So maybe the fact that they were both performers, which means that they probably did go through some kind of vocal training, you know, to be able to sing and to act. So maybe that helps to support the larynx so that they don't deal with the changes in the gravelly voice the same as other ghouls do. So that could be a possibility, you know, because if you are a performer, you do vocal training and things, and you're strengthening up the muscles that support the larynx and things so that you've got more control over what your voice is doing. So that could help as a possibility. And the other big thing is sociological issues. So ghouls do face an awful lot of discrimination and hostility in the wasteland. People call them zombies, call them shamblers, and things like that. And that is to non-feral ghouls is considered offensive, understandably. It's a pretty rude thing to say, and they resent it. Again, fair enough. And they do counter it, as unfortunately human nature is like that it's a tit for tat kind of thing. So they call humans smooth skins. That's their right to do that. But, and part of the discrimination probably is their appearance. It's unfortunately, it is something, again, it can be human nature, that people that are considered conventionally attractive tend to be treated better than people that are not conventionally attractive. If people do have disabilities or change, something different about their appearance, even things like sort of birthmarks or vitiligo and things like that people can be less kind of willing to engage with someone that doesn't look the same as somebody that's kind of conventionally attractive. It's a thing that happens. Shouldn't be the case, but it is something that happens. There are some people that are attracted to the ghouls. There's some people that do kind of fetishize them, which is a whole other issue, really. That again kind of it reflects a bit of like racism, really, in that sense that it's like people are like, oh, I'm not racist because I think that these people are actually very attractive, and that can still have kind of some racist connotations. So something to bear in mind. Another thing is the fear of catching it. That people that engage or spend time around ghouls are going to become ghouls themselves. Kind of like how people were treated. If you look at the Bible and the way people with leprosy were treated, and they were ostracized from society, and that kind of thing, and people with HIV and AIDS, how they were treated before we really understood exactly what it was and how it worked. That it was called the kind of gay acquired immune deficiency, or I can't remember exactly what the acronym was, but and it was something that was levelled at kind of gay men and things because they were in a kind of higher risk category for catching it. But it's not being a ghoul's not contagious though in that sense. It's not something that you can catch by spending time around them. But again, there is that thing of separating them and us, and we don't want them around because they're different. It's a thing. And the other major factor is the fear of ghouls becoming feral. Certainly now that we're past the 200-year mark since the bombs, it's widely accepted that ghouls just go feral eventually. And we'll talk about the potential preventative for that later on. But there is some truth to this fear, as it really does seem like most, if not all, ghouls will eventually go feral. Some societies and people are more accepting of ghouls than others. So Marcus allowed ghouls to live in Broken Hills after the fall of the Master, along with his super mutant buddies and with humans. So there was a society there led by Marcus that had super mutants, nightkin, ghouls, and humans living there in harmony. The NCR also extended legal protections to ghouls, so that they had the same protections as humans did, which is, quite progressive of them. I think that's something. And Hancock obviously doesn't discriminate, and Good Neighbour, as long as you kind of keep out of trouble, he's going to welcome just about anyone except the synths. But ghouls are welcome to live there. You've got a self-aware, sentient Assaultron that lives there and runs a business there. That's all fine as long as you're not a synth. Hancock doesn't really care. But other factions and places are not willing to tolerate ghouls. Vault City, which was the people from Vault 8, absolutely we're not going to tolerate ghouls. The Brotherhood of Steel sees them as an abomination to be eliminated, even the non-feral ones, really. The Enclave wants to purify humanity, so they don't want ghouls around either because they're mutants and that can't be tolerated. And The vast majority of ghouls were banned from the Strip in New Vegas, and they were kicked out of Diamond City by Mayor McDonough as well. So, a lot of societies around the place just, they're not interested in having ghouls, and they do, you know, ban them from living there and don't like them even coming into trade or anything like that. So there's a lot of that kind of thing and a lot of that discrimination. And of course, there are some ghouls that kind of fuel these problems with their own behaviour. Just like people, there are some ghouls that are just bad eggs and horrible people. Set in Necropolis and Roy Phillips in the Capital Wasteland are great examples of this. Because with Tenpenny Tower, even if you set up a peaceful resolution where you get Tenpenny to let the ghouls move in so that everybody can live together, you go back a few days later and all the humans are dead in the basement, and Roy Phillips doesn't care what you think about it. So people are going to people even after horrendous mutations have changed them physically. And to avoid the prejudice and discrimination, many ghouls have set up their own societies and settlements to try and prove themselves to be just as civilised as humans, but they're choosing to live separately in order to protect themselves. So the Bright Brotherhood at Repcon test site, the Slog where we are right now, Underworld, they're all good examples of this. And it's understandable that they'd want to protect their peace and just live their lives, because ghouls are people. They come in all shapes and sizes, are just as varied in terms of personality, which means there's good guys, there's bad guys, there's morally questionable people. Just the way a human society is, and people all have grand ideas that we should all get along and stop treating each other horribly, but human nature is that that's very difficult to achieve. And I think, society in the real world reflects that quite nicely as well. I have to say, I do like this at night where it's all lit up, the swimming pool. It's really cool. I love this settlement. It's one of my favourites. But what about the ferals? That's a whole different story. So let's go and see if we can find some. There we go. I knew this would be the place to come. So we're here at College Square. Just above, just north of the Cambridge police station, because this is generally a good place if you're looking for feral ghouls. You'll find them here. Also mines. But yeah, we've got some ferals here roaming around, keeping watch, that kind of thing. So yeah, we need to talk about the feral ghouls and the differences between them and the ghouls. So it's accepted that ghouls are just going to become feral eventually. Nobody has pinpointed exactly why, and the change to becoming feral can be immediate, and that happened to hundreds and thousands of people when the bombs fell. But for other people, it happens over a period of time, and we can learn this from Kiddie Kingdom and Nuka World, that the ghouls did just start eventually becoming afflicted, and they became feral until there was only a couple of them left, Rachel and Oswald. And they tried to find a solution and couldn't find one. So it does seem to be that excessive exposure to radiation plays a role, as well as social isolation. So we know that, ghouls are healed by radiation and they tend to be attracted to it, especially the ferals, but it does also seem to be that being exposed to a lot of radiation also kind of increases the chance of them becoming feral and potentially fast tracks that process. And social isolation is also part of it. Like, there's the guy in the cabin, Gorski cabin, which is a score here somewhere. Yeah, Gorski cabin. So guy was locked in his basement, and he was trying to make a bomb to blow up the pylon thing that was put in front of his house because he wasn't happy about it. And he had a disassembled mini nuke, so he was obviously exposed to radiation, and he was locked in there on his own, so he did go feral. In the Glowing Sea, you don't really find any non-feral ghouls. There's plenty of feral ghouls. And they are dangerous, they're aggressive, and they're kind of mindless, so they are more like zombies in that sense, where they really just have the most basic kind of animal instincts to them. There's not much reason or thought behind their actions. So what is it that's happening here? The feralization is caused by degeneration of the brain that leads to loss of these higher brain functions and returning to the basic animal instincts. So they're aggressive, they can't speak, they don't really have logic or reasoning, and they also have an increased appetite for food. So They have a very loose social structure where they tend to congregate in groups. But they just mindlessly attack anything that isn't a feral ghoul, and sometimes even non-feral ghouls, and they'll screech to alert the others in the area that there's a threat. They don't have the ability to use tools or weapons, so they attack with their hands, and they tend to, they're uninhibited, so that's why they're fast, and they can be quite strong. So they lose some of the inhibition that protects their body, and they don't have any strategy. They just charge in head first and attack whatever's in front of them. They tend to congregate in dark environments, so you do find them in places that are dark and damp, like the tunnels, the underground railway stations, metro stations, and things, and the sewers, that kind of thing. And especially places where there is radioactive material, they are obviously kind of attracted to that because it heals them, even though it's also potentially causing harm to the brain. And they are generally quite aggressive towards most living things. So even like creatures and things, the ghouls will fight them. They can be kind of docile if they're kept well fed, but I really wouldn't recommend keeping a pet feral ghoul. It's not a good idea, and somebody could end up getting hurt in that situation. So because they do hang out in underground locations, people do sometimes think that, they don't like the sun or they don't like the heat of the daytime, but they do, you find them on the surface during the day and things. They don't really seem to be affected by that in that sense, and they will roam around in the daytime as well. But they possibly prefer the dark. I mean, their eyesight isn't great. You don't even seem to have any eyes. Your eyes, oh, there you are. Your eyes are glowing. They seem to have poor vision, so they're more likely to react if they hear you than if they see you. And you can in the dark, you can sneak past them quite easily if your sneak capabilities are quite good. And some of the models in game do have cloudy eyes, so it does look like they've got clouding of the cornea, which is the kind of clear front membrane covering your eye. Because if it wasn't clear, you wouldn't be able to see. And then cataracts, which is clouding of the lens that's inside the eye. And, their visibility isn't good, but their hearing seems to be better. So there's not a lot of confirmed information on why ghouls go feral. The thing that makes the most sense to me, and certainly that's what Dr. Barrows in the Chop Shop and Underworld speculated as well, is that it's neural degeneration. So while the ghouls do have capabilities to regenerate tissues in their body and other organs, not every cell type is as capable of regeneration. So it is a thing that happens. So some organs and tissues are really good at regeneration. Your skin and your hair are being lost and replaced pretty much constantly. And, your hair grows. If you shave your head, it's going to grow back, unless you do have alopecia or something. It's something, because otherwise cutting your hair would be pretty permanent, and skin wounds would have to be stitched closed forever. Skin can regrow itself, even if a wound where the skin has been lost is so big that stitching it closed isn't an option. If it's too big, there'd be too much tension. You can't stitch the wound edges together. Then you have to leave it to heal by what's called second intention, which is where you have an open wound where there's a large area of skin missing that can't be closed over, so you just have to keep it protected and keep it moist. And then what happens is what's called granulation, so you get this layer of pink tissue that has a really high blood supply, and then the new skin grows from the outside toward the middle. So these wounds, they take obviously a lot longer to heal than if it's a wound that you can stitch closed. But the granulation tissue creates a scaffolding, and then skin regenerates from the outside towards the middle, so you would see the wound just get smaller and smaller and smaller until it heals over. More likely to scar as well, and it does take a lot longer, but it works really, really well, and with the right kind of bandaging and protection for it, it can work wonders. Especially, this isn't in my notes, but aside is that I've found that using Manuka honey on these kinds of wounds works amazing. Manuka honey is really good for boosting the healing capabilities, and it has antibacterial properties as well. I remember a cat that was brought in. It had been hit by a car, and it had a hell of a what's called a degloving injury, where there's basically a massive amount of skin lost on the surface of its leg, and we tried skin grafts and it failed. And we really thought we were going to have to amputate this cat's leg, but we decided to try with Manuka honey bandages and things, and we saved the cat's leg, and you would barely have known anything happened. So it was a great outcome in the end, because the skin has this capability of regenerating and regrowing itself to close over wounds. The organ that's probably one of the best for this is the liver, actually. It has a phenomenal ability to regenerate and regrow itself. Oh, oh dear, did you blow yourself up? Well, better get your body regenerating there, lady. It's funny. So basically, if you don't have any liver disease, like cirrhosis or anything, you could have up to 90% of your liver removed and it will regrow itself, which is why people can donate part of their liver to a transplant patient that they match without the patient having to wait for someone that matches them to die first so that they can get their liver. And assuming your liver is healthy, you can lose a bit of it and donate it to somebody and it will regrow and then you'll be fine. But there are tissues in the body that don't regenerate well or at all in that case. So tooth enamel doesn't regenerate, so once it's lost, it's basically lost. Cartilage, which is in your, as well as your nose and your ears that we've talked about, cartilage also protects your joints. So the cartilage is on the end of the bones in the joint, so it stops the bone rubbing against another bone, because cartilage is so hard and smooth, it keeps your joints from grinding, basically. And when people have arthritis, especially osteoarthritis, due to aging, or if they do have a disease that affects the cartilage, then it will affect the joints because the cartilage gets lost and that causes the bone to rub against the bone and it causes pain, it causes inflammation, and that's kind of how that works. So there are bits here that don't, and neurons as well don't regenerate well. Now I know we talked about neuroplasticity in the RoboBrain video, where part of the brain can take over for a bit that's been damaged and take over its function, but that's like someone quits their job and then you hire a replacement for them. Regeneration is where someone quits their job and you basically clone them and give the clone their job. That's the difference. So damaged neurons don't always regenerate, and especially the ones in the central nervous system, so the ones that are within your brain and your spinal cord. Peripheral nerves, like the ones in your hands and legs, can regenerate quite well. They have what's called the Schwann cells and the immune cells, which can help with regenerating these neurons. But the central nervous system has a lot of factors that prevent this regeneration and remyelination. So if you think of nerves like electrical wires, myelin, the myelin sheath is a kind of fatty tissue that is wrapped around the nerves, like the plastic is around electrical wires, so that obviously you don't touch live electrical wires. So the way the nervous system works, it is a lot like an electrical wire, and there's insulation, so if that's lost, that affects how the nerves work, which is what happens in diseases of demyelination like multiple sclerosis. So what that means is that once damage is done to the neurons within the brain and the spinal cord, it can be irreversible. And if there is an ongoing insult, like persistent radiation, for example, that can turn into a progressive degenerative breakdown of the organ. And it's kind of like what you see in many kinds of dementia. So Alzheimer's, which is the most common form of dementia that accounts for 60 to 70% of cases worldwide, is a progressive atrophy of the brain. So atrophy means that the organ is shrinking and it's disappearing, so it's being slowly lost. So that's what atrophy means. And particularly Alzheimer's targets the hippocampus, which is called that because it's the part of the brain that's right in the middle between the two hemispheres, and it looks like a seahorse, which is what hippocampus is in Latin or Greek, one of the two. But that's what it's called. And the hippocampus is important for memory, and it's responsible for filing memories into long-term storage versus short-term memory and things like that. So that would explain why people with Alzheimer's do lose memories of things. It also targets the temporal lobes, which are responsible for visual memory, language comprehension, and emotional association, and the parietal lobe, which is also involved in language processing and sensory reception. So, all these kind of really important parts of the brain that are involved with memory, with language, with processing sensory input, emotional regulation get damaged, and eventually the damage spreads to the other parts of the brain as well. So, the hypothesis that was suggested by research from Rachel and Oswald in Yucca World and Dr. Barrows in Underworld suggests that the radiation does damage the brain and eventually all capacity for higher brain functions like logic and reason and language are lost, and that leaves these ghouls with basic animal instincts. Can fertilization be prevented? Well, it depends on who you ask. So, Rachel Watkins from Yucca World, she never found an answer, and she had been searching for potentially a long time. It's not really clear exactly how long she was away, but from the way Oswald was talking, it does seem like it's been certainly several years, if not several decades, that she's been away searching for a solution to the affliction, as he calls it. But she does say in her holotape that she visited many settlements and she talked to a lot of people and found nothing, and people just told her, ghouls just go feral eventually. It's just the way it is. But the TV series gives us quite a different answer. I will point out, because I know people talk about this as if it's a retcon, but the TV series takes place in 2296, which is 9 years after Fallout 4, and also is set on the other side of the country. And it's 15 years since Fallout New Vegas, which was the last time that we were in that side of the country in the Fallout stories. So that's plenty of time for some enterprising chemists to come up with something that could delay the onset of fertilization. We don't know anything about it. It's just called vials. There's no name for this chemical that's given to us in the TV show, but it's a kind of yellowy clear liquid that's dispensed in an inhaler. So like you would for, if you had asthma, or a jet as well works in that kind of sense that it's inhaled. And it seems to have been proven to be quite profitable for chem dealers, which kind of fits with the fact that, once we're, so far down the line, we're well over 200 years, looking at nearly kind of 220 plus years post bombs. So probably a lot of ghouls are starting to feel like things are changing and they maybe are heading towards fertilization. Because so much time has passed. And the important thing to note as well is that this stuff, it's not a cure. It has to be taken regularly to stave off the fertilization. We see that in the TV show with the ghoul's friend Roger. He'd ran out and he was sitting in this house, and he knew that he was heading for fertilization, but the ghoul didn't have any spare vials because Lucy broke them, so he couldn't give him anything, so he had to put the guy out of his misery. So a ghoul would need to be able to make sure that they were earning enough money to keep stocked up on this stuff. It's kind of implied that it's the same thing that the snake oil guy, in my head I call him chicken liver, and it's because of that bit with the chickens, and also the very old South Park episode. That's what comes into my head, so that's what I call that guy in my head. But he gives this stuff to Thaddeus that seems to be turning him into a ghoul. Again, we don't have a lot of detail from that, but I suspect it's going to become a plot point as we go into season 2, so we'll have to see how that goes. But this stuff certainly could be relatively new, and it's just not available on the East Coast. So travelling across the entire continental US and the Fallout universe is difficult. A lot of miles with a lot of dangerous things in the way, there's even just travelling around DC or around Boston or around, the outskirts of Vegas is dangerous, never mind trying to get all those hundreds of miles across the country. So, the Enclave and the Brotherhood have got access to technology that make it possible for them to travel great distances. But a random ghoul from Nuka World probably doesn't have quite the same capability, so it doesn't seem likely that she would have been able to make it to the West Coast and back, given all the dangers and the amount of time that would take and the amount of distance involved. It seems unlikely that she got that far. But it could be that this stuff has been invented since then, and it is relatively new. We don't really know enough about it to say that, but I don't believe that substance is a retcon. I think it's probably something that's relatively new that somebody has come up with and obviously seen the profit in it because capitalism and things. But, it's not a bad thing that we got something that these ghouls can use to help stop them turning into these things. And certainly that's the case for these neurodegenerative diseases in the real world, like dementia. We don't really have a lot of medical treatments for it, unfortunately. Once the process starts, once the disease starts, there's not really much that can be done. There's not a lot of evidence that any medications really delay the progression. So the focus tends to be on symptomatic management to try and just make these people as comfortable as possible and to help manage them, because the people that suffer from dementia, they can get quite distressed and they can get quite frustrated and things, and they do struggle to regulate their emotions as well. So giving them things that can help them to not be as stressed and to help them cope is what's typically used. Sometimes psychological therapies and mental exercises can help, but most people that develop this disease are going to just be on palliative care until they reach the end of their life. So this new drug that seems to be invented, it might be able to do something to stimulate repair mechanisms that exist in the neurons of the brain that aren't normally there, or facilitate the regenerative ability getting into the brain in some way. Again, we don't have a lot of actual physiological data on exactly how that works, but there's a thing that's called the blood-brain barrier, and this is a mechanism in the body that prevents things from the blood getting into the fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord, called the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which is easier to say. And only things that the brain wants, like oxygen and glucose and things, get across that barrier, but the liver during metabolism produces things that are toxic, like ammonia, which obviously you don't want to get into the brain, so this barrier prevents that kind of stuff, and only the things that we want to get into the brain get across this barrier. But there are some drugs that can cross that as well, so centrally acting painkillers, for an example, which is opiates, so your morphine, methadone, all these kinds of things, codeine is there. So there's an interesting one. So loperamide hydrochloride, which a lot of people probably know as Imodium, is actually an opiate technically, but it can't cross this barrier, the blood-brain barrier, so it can't have any effect on the nervous system. It doesn't give any pain relief or any of the other kind of effects of opiate drugs, but it still slows down the movement of the gut. So all opiates do that. So they basically slow down the peristalsis, the movement of the intestines. So that's why loperamide Imodium is used to treat diarrhea, because it slows down movement of stuff through the intestines. But all opiates do that. But loperamide can't work on the central nervous system. So that's why it's available over the counter, because it can't do any of the other things that other opiate drugs do. But it works very well for treating diarrhea. So whatever this drug does, it must cross that blood-brain barrier somehow and do something to delay the degeneration of the brain. I say I'm not an expert in neurology. I have a neuropathy, but it's not my area of expertise. I know what it's like to have a peripheral neuropathy. Not fun, I will say. But there's a lot that we don't really know about the central nervous system. We're still learning new things about the brain all the time. But there are a number of different things that basically prevent regeneration happening in the central nervous system, and they could be targets for this drug. But without having actual research on it, all we can really do is speculate. But it would have to delay or slow down the progression just from the way it works in the universe. It can't cure the problem, it can't reverse it. Because otherwise it wouldn't have to be taken regularly. It would be a one and done and everything's fixed. And that's the case for a lot of chronic health issues. So it really is similar to, chronic health issues that can be degenerative diseases, especially. And there's no amount of yoga or green juice that's going to reverse these diseases. These kinds of things are often incurable. Certainly, the autoimmune disease that I have is incurable. I just have to manage it with medication and various other things. It's the way it goes, and the ghouls becoming feral like that is part of that, unfortunately. And it's an interesting concept, and as I say, I think this anti-feral drug was probably developed quite recently in the timeline. There's not really a huge amount of research funding or anything in the Fallout universe, and training new scientists and things isn't exactly easy to do. And given that, ghouls face a lot of prejudice from humans in places, that there's less people that are going to be interested in studying this and doing anything that might help make life better for these people. Most people are just going to shrug and say, no, ghouls just go feral, and accept that they need to be put out of their misery when that happens. But at least one enterprising chemist has come up with something that seems to help. So some ghouls can hold off that inevitable deterioration in the brain function. But I say we don't really get a lot of information about it. There's not really much, to tell us exactly what it is, where it came from. But we can see that it's not something that is a cure. It's a treatment. It's for something that's going to be long-term management is what it's going to need. So kind of an interesting one. Maybe we will learn more as we get into season 2. I'm very much looking forward to it. It's only a few days now until the first episode drops, so we shall see how that goes. And if you want to hear any thoughts on the episodes as we go, I'm definitely open to making some videos and talking about the events that happen, because if nothing else, I'm very excited to get back to New Vegas and see what's happening there. So that should be interesting to see. So let me know what you think in the comments. Always love to hear from you guys, and hopefully you'll come back for more. Tuesday we're going to be visiting another interesting location in Point Lookout. I'm really enjoying the Point Lookout stuff. There's so much to that DLC that I didn't know existed until I started looking into it. Definitely should have explored it more when I played it the first time, but we're doing it now, so hopefully you'll come back and join me for that, and I will catch you guys next time. Bye!